Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
We're beginning a series of episodes on particular cities, focusing on one city at a time and trying to discuss the idea of a city, how it might exist in the mind of its inhabitants, visitors or outsiders, perhaps even contrary to the reality of life there. We have no problem imagining through mythology cities like New York or Paris. So can we understand anything of cities through narratives or literature? And today we're going to be talking about Perth, the capital of Western Australia. It's often cited as the most geographically isolated capital city on Earth and sits in the same time zone as 2/3 of the world's population. It is one of the largest and least dense metropolises. It seems both bigger and smaller than it really is. So Emma Jackson's our guest today. She's an architect and now textile designer. We studied together in Western Australia and she's been our colleague at RMIT in Melbourne, where she carried out a series of projects under the title of The Strange, exploring the world of Western Australia's mining town urbanism and its vast landscapes. Her fascination with this and with geology has brought her to design tapestries and textiles drawn from geological formation. At once both a local and a partial outsider to Perth, there's perhaps a particular view Emma can bring to this city through that series of lenses. But as an intro to the idea of the Perth, Rayner Banham in his 1971 book Los Angeles, The Architecture for Ecology says, Los Angeles is the greatest city on the shore in the world. Its only notable rival, in fact, is Rio de Janeiro, and its only rival in potential is probably Perth, Western Australia. We could also talk about Perth's weird relation to NASA and the often heard claim that Perth was the first city to be seen from space. In Charles Waldheim's intro to Richard Weller's 2009 book Boomtown 2050, Scenarios for a Rapidly Growing City, he says, Perth first registered in international media in 1962 by turning on its lights to illuminate the southwestern coast of Australia for astronaut John Glenn, orbiting the Earth in Friendship 7. Perth's singularity and remoteness make it an unlikely indicator of tendencies and trends evident elsewhere. Perth is closer to the urban populations of Indonesia and Malaysia than to the eastern Australian metropolises of Sydney and Melbourne. Even the city's website describes Perth with no small pride as the most remote urban centre in the world. Perth named itself the City of Light after it turned on those lights for John Glenn in 1962, and the connection to NASA continued when in 1979 the space station Skylab crash-landed in West Australia east of Perth. It was a relief to NASA and many others that it ended its orbit in some of the least populated land on Earth. There's a similar narrative of isolation in Christos Tsiolkas' story titled Civil War from the 2014 collection Merciless Gods. In its opening, the narrator says, Perth, all bland office buildings and vast suburban stretches, is a modern city at the edge of the world. It is an automated, clean city. The railway stations don't have toilets in them, as though it wasn't a city for human use. The landscape makes a mockery of their attempts to control and master the environment. Even in the middle of the business district, in the dead centre of the city's heart, the ancient sand seeps through every crack. With every strong gust of wind, the sand rises and swirls and dusts the concrete and plastic with a faint orange tinge. The sand is not the only ancient element which taunts and threatens the city. This white city lives in fear of the shadows cast by its black inhabitants. And Tsiolkas goes on, I was not impressed by the swiftness of the electric trains and the efficiency of the state-of-the-art communication systems. Instead, I loved hearing him talk about the soil eating away at this baby metropolis. By the time I'd arrived in Perth, I had stopped believing in cities. So welcome, Emma. That's perhaps a bit of a provocation about the city we're going to talk about. Perhaps we could start with your general position towards Perth and how you kind of live in relation to it.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Ian. Well, I think Perth was the first city I came to live in Australia, and I actually arrived in 1979, shortly after Skylab. And I think I was born in Melbourne, but I understood Australia from growing up as an expat kid, so always through the lens of geology or I guess the East Coast was where all my family was from. So when we came back from overseas, we always went to New South Wales. So Perth was quite new, and I'd come from West Africa. And my grandpa had sent me lots of taped. He used to read stories about Australia and on tape. So I had this wildly kind of, I guess, romantic idea of what Australia was going to be like to move here. And when I got to Perth, it was quite a culture shock. It was not what I was expecting at the age of 9. So and then as Graham said, I went to school and I went to uni there, and then I came across to Melbourne in '97. And I've now been in Melbourne longer than Perth. And I think I have an interesting relationship with Perth. I think it was, Perth was going through growing pains. I was probably going through growing pains. There's some very I guess, traumatic memories there for me, but also very fond memories of growing up there and what the city was like. And then I came to Melbourne and just was so excited to be in a really thriving city, because Perth was not the sort of city you went to on the weekend when I was a kid. It was pretty empty on the weekend, whereas Melbourne was the kind of city you would come to the city on the weekend and you would hang out in the city, and it was, a kind of rich experience that felt like a sort of big city experience.
I think probably that chimes up in my experience too. And this last line from Cholkos about not believing in cities, there is a sense, and I think something in your work on The Strange taps into this, that it's a city that doesn't quite believe in itself, or doesn't quite believe in sort of cities as we might conventionally understand them. It's often sort of understood in relation to this really vast landscape that it sits in. And it also goes to a comment you made when we were talking before this, that that somehow it's a city that sketched itself out much bigger than that it has become.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that if you think about the premise for a city or why a city is started, like Perth is so extraordinary. Like what underpins it is so volatile. The way that it was started, nobody knew how big the mining boom was going to be. It's just a beautiful place, and it's got very fertile soil. So it was settled in, but then it's very isolated. And I think nobody knew until the early 80s how big the mining was going to be. So I think the commitment you have to a city when you build a city was changing all the time. And Perth is like an example of, having to respond to huge influxes of population, huge, I guess, differences in agendas or purpose, and then its relationship, I guess, to all the mining towns to the north. So not only is it the most isolated city, but it's also it's got the biggest differential in population between it and the other towns or cities near it to anywhere else. So the population is really big in Perth. I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's incredibly high for a state.
I think it's over 90% of the state, and the state itself is vast in area.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know Western Australia, it is an area kind of almost the size of Europe, and it's a third of the continent.
And I think the thing that interested me from my PhD started from the Royalties for Regions program, which was addressing that 90% of the state was living in Perth and trying to move some of that population up and into the regions. And yet so my PhD specifically looked at, what they were doing, what their agendas were, how they were injecting that money into developing towns and cities up north.
I mean, just to sketch out a bit of background as well for those who sort of don't understand how the mining industry works there and the fly-in, fly-out culture, it does really kind of affect that sense of the fragility of the urban culture when there are so many people at the airport, for example, commuting to a town 2 hours away where by plane, where there's no town really set up. It's just a fly into the mining site and back to the city.
Yeah, and I think the mining towns were all like, we don't know how long we're going to last. It's all very it's completely unpredictable population. So there was a lack of commitment. I guess they could only commit maybe 6 months at a time. So the whole urban plan was either on hold, suspended, or a 6-month urban plan. So we'll just make do for 6 months, and then suddenly that 6 months turned into 5 years, and it was a completely inadequate social arrangement for the population. And Perth's a little bit like that too. Like, think about Barrack Street and and the big wide streets of the city back in the 80s. And the fact that it was empty, it's got that sort of ghost town feel about it. It's not like that now. It's completely different. But back then it was really like there was a sense of, we're building this city a bit Wayne's World, and with the kind of always this optimistic hope. It's a prospecting thing too, isn't it? Like there was that it was a city of discovery, of mining, of giving it a crack, and all of those things I think are reflected in the kind of planning of it.
Right. I mean, it is really sort of fascinating as, and I say this is from the perspective of someone that hasn't visited Perth, but I think just the language of how prospecting or a mining corporation might look at extracting resources and trying to compare that with an urban plan in terms of its capacity to be speculative or even deal with more elastic sort of conditions. It is a really compelling idea for how you might establish a city relative to more organically grown cities over time.
Yeah, it is, and I think if you could capture that as an idea and put that in place and interpret that into infrastructure from the outset, that would be a really interesting idea. But I think in some ways it suffered a little bit from the kind of the growth and the inability to accommodate that quickly enough in a comprehensive story, I guess, or narrative for the urban. But there was interesting when I was younger. There was a couple of really interesting things I remember about Perth, and one was Joondalup. Do you remember Joondalup when it started? It was a brand new city, or I guess
it's a satellite north of the old city.
Yeah, and
the 19th century city. Yeah,
they paved it all in kind of this pale salmon brick pavers, and all the bricks. It was in the city plan for all the bricks of the buildings had to be in that salmon brick as well. And the roads were also salmon. So you got to that, you drove to Joondalup and you knew when you were in Joondalup because everything just turned salmon.
Or beige.
Or
maybe
beige.
Salmon makes it sound more exotic somehow. Yeah.
And I feel like I never forgot that as the strength in, putting something into policy and how that plays out when everybody just has to follow those rules and how you get a vision. I mean, it was... It wasn't something you'd necessarily publish in an architecture magazine, but it was still very powerful as at what can play out if you put interesting things, I guess, in the urban design policy.
Yeah, it's an interesting. You're right that there's a real impulse towards sort of evenness in every sense, sort of socially. It's really relatively low levels of differentiation across this vast urban fabric. So it's not like, the opposite of New York where you can cross a street and the poverty just suddenly kicks in. There's no sense of that in Perth. And but there's also sort of an impulse towards, as you say, a kind of an evenness of the urban fabric, evenness of the density, the scale and the material and so on.
Yeah, I think that that also affected the way I was thinking about the Strange Studios as well, in that you could respond to something, like, given the power of that evenness in Joondalup, that if you were to actually have those kind of, what would you call them, rules, respond to something like the geology underground or soil or, I guess, the behaviour of water, or something that was actually connected you to the sort of living ecosystem beneath you.
Yeah, I have vivid memories of going to Joondalup when you could see earth movers just ripping into this really ancient and quite fragile landscape and taking out sort of metres deep of yellow sand.
Yeah.
And the sense that geology just does not exist. I think Richard Weller's book captures that as well, the sense of this quite fragile landscape that's being kind of sort of eating itself through. It's just its vastness and its incredibly low density.
Yeah, I think that, yes, and I think even in the intro where you read out that the sort of sand is blowing through, I think I really had that feeling of the way you build. It's not just Perth, but Perth is a good example, where the ground or the ground beneath just spits the buildings back out, like it just doesn't receive them. And that's where I think I got that fascination with Mad Max, because I think that the spirit of like the toe cutter and that kind of anger felt a bit like a rebellion of just recognise the wildness and the kind of age and the, I guess, fragility as well of the landscape, and rather than trying to just cloak it, carpet it in an evenness. I think that's where a lot of the stuff from The Strange came from me, is that fight back.
Well, the story I was quoting the beginning of from Cholcos, the Civil War, it's the opening to a short story which gets incredibly ugly and violent and through the narrative of this truckie driving east. It's got quite a Mad Max quality about it.
Yeah. I mean, Emma, I'm also sort of reminded of Tim Flannery, the paleontologist, environmentalist, and conservationist, who, in his book *The Future Eaters*, argues that for much of modern history, Australians have sought to make the continent conform to European ideals rather than adapting themselves to its unique ecological conditions. And this effort is most notably the attempt to recreate a sort of second Britain, and has led to profound environmental degradation. So Flannery contends that while often motivated by nostalgia or cultural sentiment, such actions have been ecologically destructive and outright sort of exploitation. And I understand that a lot of these ideas are also shared with your practice and how you kind of have used I guess algorithms and computation and other such themes in mapping to sort of uncover and unravel a lot of these histories and stories. To some degree, I'm also interested in how they work with this idea of urbanism as creating a kind of fantasy or urban fantasy that's now projected against resource decline or a climate reality. How do we begin to dismantle the fantasy that still underpins so much of city planning or Australian city planning?
I don't think, I've never believed in sort of clean slate, pulling back and starting again, but I think the amount of growth that's still happening here and the amount of policy that's still being written, I think there's definitely opportunities. I mean, as you read that quote from Tim Flannery, I could feel the anger in me rising again. I think that's where my PhD came from, and the Strange Studio is this, poor response to our country and how how diverse it is geologically. Like it's got ground in it that's really, today all the way back to the beginning of planet Earth, much of which is in WA. So I think that for me it was a sort of a battle cry for trying to get urban design and architects thinking more about the ground we build on, because we just grid it up, or have done, just gridded it up in a very European way, and there was that sense of feeling more comfortable if people had to come, I guess, from Britain to Australia. There was that sense of trying to make it worth their while and make it feel more comfortable and make it feel more like home, so that the British suburb was laid out here regardless of whatever the ground was. And then you translate that in a city like Perth, where people then got comfortable in Perth, and then the government had to try and get people up into the mining towns to live there and not feel like they were too far from home. So then the houses in the mining towns were an iteration of the houses in Perth, which were an iteration of the British house, all of which fail on 4.6 billion year old ground. So yeah, I feel like there's a sense of Perth of you're not too far from home. I get that's the planning policy.
You mean home being Europe or
potentially,
or UK?
But it's obviously changed over time.
It's interesting when you were talking about this too, Ian. The sort of the problems of the DNA sort of implanting a British, let's say, city in the middle of this landscape, and yet, if only we had kind of a British or European kind of footprint to that city, because it's far outstripped that as an urban proposition. It is twice as sprawled as Melbourne, which is a vast city. So it's taken that model and just ramped it up on steroids to an unbelievable extent, and it seems normal from within it, but it is astonishingly sprawled.
It is so sprawled. I think the weird thing about Perth is it's very linear. It's a very linear city. I think it's one of the most linear cities in the world. So you need a car. I mean, so in that sense, it's a little bit unsustainable. But it also it has the Darling Fault, which goes from the bottom, from Albany, all the way up to past Geraldton, and that divides 4.6 billion year old geology, which is really, really hard ground, and some of the Earth's oldest continental crust, from the youngest. So it's a really weird split, and all that young ground is very fertile, so you can't really build much past the Darling Fault. But it was so fertile that people, I guess, just kept building all up and down the coast, and it's so beautiful. But it's a real hedging your bets type urban proposition.
Yeah.
Continually hedging your bets.
I mean, what hadn't sort of occurred to me initially was, I guess, just how dependent the development of the city was in relation to, prospecting. And I think what's coming across as being really compelling is, on one hand, it is about these very short-term sort of bursts and set alongside, billions of years of history. And I think your practice particularly is kind of now, working at a different scale to try and understand, how we might factor these ideas or these thinkings or these layers into a sort of understanding that could be, captured more spatially. Do you think there's a lot of scope for integrating that thinking of deep time into, I guess, cities that now try to function, or even development that's more real time? How do you see the two sort of intersecting?
Well, I hope so, because I feel like now as Melbourne's getting bigger and bigger, I just feel like more disconnected than ever. So I feel like that what I'm trying to do is, well, I guess it's all from an optimistic point of view that underpins all my work, that Australia is incredible and we have incredible ground here with incredible stories. So why would you just carpet it in a mediocre British urban design? Like, why would you do that when there's so many more interesting ideas and generators? So I guess, yes, I would hope that we could do that, because I think if we don't, we're just going to be all so disconnected.
Mm.
And we've already got, not that I want to bang on about social media and being on screens, but that is the reality.
Yeah.
And I feel like with my work, what I'm trying to do is just connect us to something bigger continually to so that you do get that feeling that I used to get in WA, which I loved, which is that you're just in the middle of something much bigger, much more profound, much older, makes you feel much smaller. And, you know, there's a kind of hope and humbleness that comes from that, and a lack of, what was the word you used to describe Perth and where you evenness, that there is no evenness like in the ground we build and live on. Like it's got like really old stories, and we could respond to that. And then maybe when you're walking down Collins Street, so I have this idea with Collins Street where it changes geologically quite significantly all the way down Collins Street. So imagine if the paving was just slightly different, like we go from bluestone to suddenly a sandstone and then back to bluestone again, and you actually register that ground underneath and that change. And then there's a huge amount of geological difference around the Yarra River and the behaviour of the Yarra River. And that would be very easy to integrate, and, you know, in small patches where you have to rebuilding of certain parts of the city, and it can be it's amazing how a small change can make a big difference.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think this is a good chance for a little pause. Maybe we'll have a quick break, and then we'll restart that conversation. The music break for this episode, again and appropriately, comes from our favourite Perth-based artist, Sam Tout. It's a new release from him called A Long Type-Rope. So, Emma, I was really fascinated by this beautiful description you gave of this big landscape and a sort of a city design understanding that. And I was sort of connecting in my mind back to the opening discussion about the city seen from space and this enormous sky that's often sighted in the West Australian landscape as well. So you've got this kind of big crust of earth and this big skyscape.
Well, I'm just thinking about when John Glenn flew over and the lights that the city of Perth put on so that he could see it from space, and that was set up because Perth is so far from every other city that there's no kind of competing light pollution, and you've just got blackness, and there was an opportunity for everybody to put lights on. And which is in a sense reflects back to the geology that it's so, that it's got that really ancient geology between it and the east coast, which means you can't really occupy that geology. And then you've got the ocean to the west. And I remember people making these sky torches, which were like putting your fitted sheet on top of the hills hoist and then getting all the torches from the house. Not that I was alive then.
I was going to say you didn't remember it.
I don't remember it, but I remember reading about it. And everybody, like kids, adults, all sitting under the hills hoist with their torches trying to make these sky torches. And it worked.
I think my parents did do it, actually.
You really needed a photo of that. I think there are photos.
It was about creating as much light as possible to illuminate this really thinly populated city in many ways.
Yeah, and I just love that idea. It's so sublime that a city can have a whole agenda where they have this performative aspect where they have to be seen from space. And I think that the fact that Perth is proud of that. I guess my practice is always about how do you find something super interesting to build the city around, and Perth's just got so much collateral, like the whole city could be designed around, you could really embrace that idea that it has to be seen from space. And that, if you invite visitors to Perth and they say, this city feels really strange the way it's designed, and then the people showing them around would say, well, that's because it has to be seen from space. And then of course, it all makes sense. So I like that idea that there's, the sense of the sublime, or that cities could perform on a different level, or that we could, that there are just ideas that can be plucked out of somewhere, some space.
Well, that's where the word strange is so powerful for you, because it's this sense that this city does not need to be in any way like European cities, in the same way that Frank Lloyd Wright had some sense of the American city not bearing any trace of the European.
It's kind of own it. It's so cool. It's like amazing. I mean, I kind of really love Perth and I love WA. It's kind of, full of speculative, plucky, and it's game, It's, it'll just... So I think that was what my PhD and the Strange Studios was all about, was not trying to do what you think you should do from a planning point of view, but working with what's actually there, finding what seems strange because it's not been done before, which is why it seems strange. But actually, once you do it and do it again, it's no longer strange. It's only strange because it's not business as usual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So by examining the strange, you can actually find something much more particular to the place.
I think that's something, it's sort of quite a powerful sort of tactic to use that as a sort of provocation to really kind of, tease out what, I guess multiple ways in which you might read the same condition. And in the same way, you're talking about the visibility from space, that it just seems like that's just another dimension of, Perth's sort of radical isolation. And are there ways in which you think that could translate from, the scale of the city, which is already quite large, and as something that's sort of figural and legible from the distance, versus, I guess, more sort of, nuanced conditions or differences between, where the CBD might end and suburbs start, or conditions within the city that could register some of these narratives?
I think so. I almost wonder as you're talking whether it doesn't need to be someone from outside to see that and be able to put that in place, like thinking about the strange. It only seems strange because you come in as an outsider and can appreciate the differences. And it makes me think of Ivan Ivanov and Geoffrey Howlett and how they built there, how they came from overseas.
So Ivan Ivanov arrived from Bulgaria. Geoffrey Howlett grew up in India. And then from London, yeah.
So, and they'd already had an experience of another city. And the way that they built in Perth was really different. It wasn't evenness. Like, I think the way that Ivan Ivanov built with the kind of chunky, irregular brickwork that was a little bit Frank Lloyd Wright, but sort of on crack, which is appropriate.
Yeah.
So I think, there are little moments of it already you could kind of tease out a bit. Did that answer your question? It was a long question. I had answered it 5 times before you finished.
No, it does. I guess, it was... I think you did sort of, talk about the... I think with cities, we're always trying to work out, what ideas could manifest at the scale of the city writ large versus which ones are more translatable into, the architectural scale, perhaps. And I think you do kind of, talk about that quite a bit with how these architects practiced in the city. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because what has defined Perth and the way you travel through it, or the hierarchy of the city and how it's built outside of the city. Like in Melbourne, there's that 2-storey rule, which means the city is skyscrapers, and then there's sort of medium density. Whereas in Perth, it's very linear. And the city's always been a little bit underestimated. It's been a commercial zone, but not really necessarily a living zone. And you've got places like Leederville and...
They're a fragment. The sort of 19th century kind of setup, the planning template was quite like Melbourne. Not coincidentally. And then it sort of just kind of broke out of that in the 20th century.
But it's a weird mix of huge infrastructure, like the Stirling Highway, which goes from Fremantle to the city. And then you've got Murray Street. Remember how big Murray Street was? It was almost like when we were there, and I worked for you on Murray Street, and it was at Hay Street.
Yeah.
And it was like this huge roads built for people to come in the future.
Well, probably turn a horse and cart around.
Yeah. So big. It wasn't built like a little template that was potato stamped around. There was already big linear frameworks.
Yeah, and I think now the linear strip north-south holds the longest metropolitan commuter train line in the world. So it is vast in scale. Even though there's a new train from the airport, I don't know if you've taken that, and it's this...
Oh, yes, I have.
Phenomenally large walk to get from the terminal to the train, and then you're on the train, yeah.
But it's very... the whole mentality... civic mentality and the way that it's played out is definitely governed by the big linear.
Right.
Which is different from other cities where it might radiate out.
Well, Ian, you were talking in the break about Algiers and this sort of linear megastructure as a Corbusian proposition. And how that, might have been sort of informed by sort of seeing the city from the air, and which I guess is a kind of comparable.
Yeah, I think it's always this it goes back to this question about being kind of legible and how very often cities are defined by a single kind of overarching idea, and in the case of Algiers, the proposition for Algiers was about how it could be captured from the air, and because that became a tool that was, or a method that was available to Corbusier at the time, and thinking about a lot of ideas that you've described about Perth, and so much of it is connected with the idea of, isolation and distance, and then also the capacity for it to be read from space because of that. And I guess equally with these ideas that are kind of, brought about externally, was the conversation that we were having earlier about, I guess even related to livability and the metrics of, that's an alien idea that's put on top of the city by The Economist, for instance. And how does that sort of have an effect on, how the city perceives itself? Because I know Perth is tends to come, quite high on that list. Like, I think they've been 12 and 15.
In terms of livability.
In terms of livability.
Yeah.
In relation to a lot of these ideas that we're kind of talking about that might seem, contradictory to that, but...
Well, it's weird because it is livable. I mean, it's an incredible city to live in from a lifestyle point of view. And then if you think about the non-livable cities, they're usually governed by how much a company has to pay its employees to go and
in order to attract them to that city.
Yeah, to make it enticing for them to uproot their lives and go and live that city. And those places are usually mining companies, and the places are very, very old ground where there's a lot of resources. So there's a direct relationship between the older the ground, which is resource rich, we're talking, depending on the resources, billions of years old ground, which is difficult to build into and expensive. So, so you're unlikely to get as big a populations there, and that would be the north of WA, is very, very old ground. But then you've got, I guess it's an anomaly when you think about it, because I don't know, it's a podcast, so I can't show you a diagram, but if you think of the shape of WA, like there's a line on the very west side, and on the west-hand side of that line, which is the Darling Fault, is very young ground where everyone lives, which is very, very livable. And that fault is like you've cut it with scissors, and then there's this really old 4.6 billion year old chunk that separates it from as far as Adelaide, really, with a bit give or take. So that's a crater and the oldest part of the Earth's crust. So you've got this very livable city from the metric point of view, from the lifestyle point of view, that's separated from the East Coast by a huge chunk of the worst livable. So, if you had to rank that, if you had to pay someone to go and live from New York to go and live in Kalgoorlie, that would be a pretty bleak prospect.
Right.
So apologies to people living in Kalgoorlie.
Well, only for New Yorkers.
Only for New Yorkers.
Obviously from Vancouver to be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't see the New Yorker arriving in Kalgoorlie.
No, actually, no. Well,
But there must be examples.
I was 18 when I got a scholarship to the Agricola School of Mines to become a mining engineer, which I turned down because I was only 17 actually. I was the only female who was not a prostitute in Kalgoorlie at the time.
Right.
So that's another metric of livability for me. So where were we?
Livability, I mean, it's a sort of the relationship between the very geology of the ground and its livability. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, because you think about West Africa, which is where I was before Perth, and then a lot of South America, a lot of India, all the places that have bits of the Earth's craton, which is the first bit of the Earth's crust, are the least livable cities. And to build into them is very, very expensive. Like the footings is the most expensive part of the building, just because it's so hard. You're literally building into iron ore.
Yeah. This is really, really fascinating, but I'm wondering, does it lead us to some sort of prescriptions? I mean, you were talking about embracing the strangeness of the landscape as a sort of a way of approaching urbanism. I'm thinking, Richard Weller's book, talks about having to really address the fragility of the landscape, the serious water problems, the problems of rethinking agriculture so it's vaguely sustainable. I'm kind of wondering, if you were consulting to some planning department in metropolitan Perth, what we could say to them. Because I just think there's a kind of a dilemma of both embracing what's kind of unusual or in some ways extreme about this landscape, and then the kind of generic kind of urban design propositions of consolidating and creating medium density. And all
I think this obsession with having lawns is a problem. The obsession with having that a successful city looks a particular way, and that's very unsustainable from a water point of view. And I remember that was one of the things that struck me first when I came to Perth as a 9-year-old, just how much of that Kings Park and how, I thought it was all dead because before Africa I was in London, and so I thought a forest was lush and whatever. So it really struck me that it looked dead, and then it sort of grew on me that sort of dried but thriving ecosystems. And I think some people have embraced it. I don't know if you remember this, Graham, but there were people who had these gardens that had English gardens and lawn, and people would spend their mornings mowing the lawns, and then they'd have these sprinkler systems going the whole time.
Yes.
And then there were people who'd gone rogue. It was perceived as going rogue and a little bit off-brand to do the native garden.
Right.
Like that was, you'd sort of...
Well, you actually notice that exactly what you're describing in the geology, the way you describe, because when you're in the hills, which is on the Darling Scarp, then the ground changes and the approaches to suburban gardens does change.
It does.
And there's a lot more gravel and
it's
red
much more
dirt
responsive.
Yeah. Through the lack of choice, really, and the bigger plots of land and so on.
Like, what would happen if we didn't carpet the whole city? Like, if we didn't have to cover every single bit of it up, what would be the risk in that? In not having lawn, what would be the risk? Not having lawn.
Be pretty strange.
What would we lose?
Yeah, a water bill.
Jim's mowing.
Well, I mean, you sort of bring it back to that initial impulse for the sort of the English garden in this driest bit of the driest continent.
It's a perception thing, isn't it, that we have to fight? It's not just urban planning, it's what we value. And if we still value and see that as success or that we're under sound leadership, if we have green grass and, lush gardens.
But I think there's also something that you kind of inferred there, but when you said, do we need to cover it all up? And so if you're an urban planner trying to increase the density of Perth, and there's a sense of it being backfilled now or sort of consolidated, and I think you're kind of suggesting something quite different, that we kind of embrace the fragmentary nature of that as well, and that there is a constant presence of landscape on that urban fabric, which is not a European understanding of the city at all.
No, it's not. And I think a lot of people now, because it was this, Perth was somewhere where you could all have the quarter-acre block, and, just according to where you could afford is how far, whether you were up or down on that linear city. And now people, especially close to the city, are breaking those blocks up and subdividing them. But I think there's probably also opportunities for different models of living. Like, I think that evenness, again, is a problem. Like, surely not every person works on a quarter-acre block. There are people who have 6 kids. There are people who are separated. There are people who are older who are struggling to cope with a huge amount of maintenance on those quarter-acre blocks if you're going to do lawn.
Indeed.
And gardens. So, yeah, I think perhaps a little bit more thought into how you occupy the ground in terms of a community, or less evenness, but more, more appropriate to the ground and to the people living on it. Whereas this market-driven grid along a line
Because I think what's really fascinating about your research into the geology of the land, it does sort of, highlight, how we, or the city's relationship with the land, and thinking at the moment that if you look at the history of Perth as being, so connected with the mining industry, and any sort of propositions now to look at what its future might be tend to replace that with some other form of extraction. If it's not the mining, then it might be some kind of energy extraction or production, or some sort of thing that can be connected to, global markets, for instance. But I think what you're suggesting here is, I guess, the potential for it to be, quite rarefied and having a lot more connection with, how we understand those conditions more differently. So I think there's something really valuable in that reading compared to just replacing it with some other form of extraction.
I think there's observations in that discussion of Perth which we can think about how they're applicable to all cities in the 21st century, but it's also probably quite a good way to wrap up the conversation. So thank you, Emma. It's really fascinating. We probably should say that there's sort of three people sitting here, none of whom live in Perth, so they're all outsiders, and I'm sure, I hope there's some West Australians listening who want to take objection to this and start a conversation for a follow-up episode. Thanks again, Emma.
Thank you, Emma.
A postscript to our Perth episode. Just as we were recording and were discussing the landscape architect Richard Weller through his brilliant book about Perth Boomtown 2050, not to mention his countless other contributions to landscape architecture, we learned of the incredibly sad news of his passing. This episode, then, is dedicated to Richard Weller.
You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.